a hidden chamber, a murdered scholar, and in a society no one dares name. Welcome to Enigma Abierto. I am your host Jack. Drop a comment below. Where are you listening from? Hearing from you makes this experience richer. Now, into the story. The scent of lavender scones mingled with fresh-cut grass as the annual Oakley Village summer tea prepared to draw its usual crowd. White bunting fluttered between chestnut trees, and folding tables were dressed with crisp linen cloths and polished silver urns. Beneath a striped canopy, ladies in pale gloves exchanged compliments over Victoria sponge cakes, while the vicar's terrier yapped excitedly underfoot, scattering a few nervous toddlers. It was, by all appearances, a perfectly English Saturday afternoon. Miss Marple, seated near the end of a long trestle table, poured her own tea with practiced hands. Her fingers, as gnarled and fine as old lace, betrayed no tremor. Clad in dove gray, with a lavender spring pinned to her straw hat, she appeared as an entirely unremarkable fixture, like the butter dish or the vicar's collection box. Yet, beneath her modest manner, her eyes observed with the quiet alertness of a cat beneath a rosebush. She was seated beside Mrs. Elspeth Ridley, a widow of 8 years and known for her glacial opinions on everything from church hymnals to imported tomatoes. "The council has approved a modern postbox, Jane," she whispered indignantly, eyes fixed on the head table. "Painted in bright blue, would you believe it? Garish." Miss Marple smiled politely but glanced instead toward the cluster of organizers near the oak tree podium. Among them stood Lawrence Biddle, chair of the Historical Preservation Society and according to whispered circles the self-declared gatekeeper of Oakley's secrets. With his tall frame, gray blazer, and pince-nez, Biddle looked the part of a country academic, but something in his posture this afternoon was off-kilter. His hand hovered nervously at his breast pocket. His smile, when addressed by Lady Clara Spence, the event's patron, looked tight as a drawstring. Just behind him, Gwen Partridge, a shy young woman recently returned from London, busied herself with repositioning a tray of tarts. She was new enough to arouse curiosity but familiar enough that half the village already knew her family's financial troubles. A year ago, Gwen's uncle Rufus Partridge had died under vague circumstances in Italy. He'd left her a modest sum, though rumors hinted at a far greater inheritance, conveniently vanished in foreign courts. As a light breeze lifted the tablecloths and stirred the sugar packets, a sudden hush swept the crowd. A sharp cry rang out, short, stifled, and unmistakably feminine. It came from the rose garden behind the trellis-arched chairs scraped back. Teacups rattled. Miss Marple rose slowly, placing her napkin gently beside her plate. Several guests rushed toward the sound, but it was Miss Jemima Blackstock, spinster and honorary secretary of the Oakley Parish Board, who stumbled into view first. Her wide-brimmed hat was askew, and her hands clutched her skirts as she gasped, "It's Lawrence, he's fallen. Someone fetch Dr. Bertram." Miss Marple followed the commotion with unhurried steps. A small crowd had already formed at the rose arbor, where Lawrence Biddle lay slumped against the root of an old moss-covered sundial. His legs were neatly folded, as if he'd knelt there voluntarily, but his head lolled at an unnatural angle. His pince-nez glinted in the grass beside him, shattered. Dr. Bertram, who'd thankfully been sipping elderflower cordial by the lemonade station, was kneeling beside the body. He opened his bag with grim resignation. "I'm afraid he's gone," he announced moments later. "No pulse. Likely a heart attack, though his lips slightly blue. Poison, perhaps? I'll need to examine it more thoroughly." Lady Clara clutched her pearls. Mrs. Ridley murmured a scandalized prayer. The vicar tried to disperse the children, though one had already begun to cry. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Blue lips," she said quietly to no one in particular, "and at a garden party. How very unfortunate." But then again, Lawrence always did prefer gin to tea. And with that soft remark, she turned back toward the tables, though her mind, already at work, had noted far more than she let on. The angle of the body. The untouched tart on the plate near the rose trellis. And the faint trace of nervous energy that had clung to Gwen Partridge not 5 minutes before. It would be some hours before the constable arrived from Much Benham. In the meantime, the bunting fluttered on. The scones sat uneaten. And the villagers began, as they always did, to whisper. By the time the sun dipped behind the steeple of St. Petrock's Church, the bunting still fluttered, but the cheer had drained from Oakley's annual summer tea like cold milk from a forgotten cup. Lawrence Biddle's body had been respectfully covered with a crocheted picnic blanket, its lavender stitching a strange mockery of the day's earlier gaiety. Most of the guests had either drifted toward the church hall to wait for the constable or loitered in tight little huddles, exchanging snippets of speculation behind carefully cupped hands. The village had never been one for silence. "Heart, they say," muttered Mr. Lionel Groves, retired solicitor and inveterate gossip, as he poured himself a third sherry inside the parish hall's wood-paneled lounge. "Though I'd wager it was that dreadful cherry tart. Cooked within an inch of its life, it was." Mrs. Ridley sniffed, seated upright near the fireplace where she could observe everyone who entered. The tarts were perfectly acceptable. You can't blame a pastry for what was likely the result of Mr. Biddle's own excesses. He never did mind his constitution. Or his company, added Mrs. Emmeline Dawlish, adjusting the fox brooch at her collar. Flitted about with all sorts of collectors, historians, and those Freemason types. Always locking himself in that study of his with old scrolls and a bottle of port. "More than scrolls, if you ask me," chimed in Reverend Elkins, his voice low, reverent, and tinged with discomfort. Rumors he'd formed some sort of gentleman's circle. A little society of sorts, meeting by candlelight in his drawing-room. "Sounds quite theatrical," Mrs. Dawlish said, arching an eyebrow. What on earth would they discuss? History, apparently. The society's name was carved into an oak table in his study. The Oak Table Society. One of those eccentric, intellectual amusements, Elkins explained. Though I was never invited to attend myself. Across the room, Miss Marple quietly sipped from a cup of lukewarm tea, nodding ever so slightly at each exchange without comment. She had always found the parish hall to be a revealing place. Something about the familiar portraits of former vicars, the tick of the grandfather clock, and the smell of stale Madeira wine encouraged honesty, even in whispers. She turned to Miss Jemima Blackstock, seated beside her with trembling fingers curled around a saucer. "You found him, I understand?" Jemima nodded, her voice still quivering. "I went to check the flower arrangements by the rose harbor of one of the younger children who had knocked over the display earlier. I thought I'd tidy it. Then I saw his foot behind the trellis." She paused, blinking rapidly. It was strange. He looked almost peaceful. But not quite. His mouth was slightly open, as though he was about to say something. Miss Marple set her cup down gently. A pity, indeed. Mr. Biddle was well regarded. Or at least, well involved. Chair of 3 societies, wasn't he? 4, Jemima corrected, more steadily now. The Historical Preservation Society, the amateur watercolor guild, the garden committee, and something new he mentioned only last week, something secret I gathered, but all in fun. Is it fun? Miss Marple asked lightly. Yes. He was laughing when he mentioned it. Said it was a return to gentlemanly tradition. Whatever that means. Miss Marple made no reply, only smoothed the hem of her skirt and turned her gaze to Gwen Partridge, who had remained seated by the hall's back wall since the incident, looking pale and distant. Gwen's gloved hands twisted a lace handkerchief in her lap. No one had approached her for questions. She was too recent a returnee to warrant familiarity. But Gwen's eyes flicked up once, just once, and met Miss Marple's with a flash of something unreadable, not quite fear, not quite guilt. Something else. Recognition, perhaps? Before Miss Marple could pursue the thought further, a commotion at the door announced the arrival of Constable Trevor Hadley, a tall, well-meaning young man who was often overwhelmed by Oakley's older, sharper residents. "Evening, all," he said, removing his cap. "Dr. Bertram tells me there's a death to be investigated." Mrs. Dawlish rose at once. "A sudden one, young man." "Lawrence Biddle." "Quite a shock to us all." "And you say it was during the tea?" "In the Rose Garden," added Reverend Elkins. "Unwitnessed, but strange all the same." Hadley nodded and pulled a small notepad from his jacket pocket. "Right. I'll need statements. Let's start with who last saw him alive." A dozen hands half raised and then withdrew, unsure whether their observations were significant enough. Miss Marple, rising with her usual unhurried poise, touched Hadley's arm with feather-light fingers. "I imagine you'll want to check the scene as well, Constable. I happened to notice that Mr. Biddle had only just received a small parcel earlier this morning hand-delivered. I watched him tuck it under his jacket as he greeted Lady Clara. It might still be on his person, or somewhere nearby." Hadley blinked. "A parcel?" "Yes. Brown paper. About the size of a small book. No address label, but wrapped with string. I'd not mention it, except that he seemed rather anxious about it." The constable straightened. "Thank you, Miss Marple. That's very helpful indeed." As he strode toward the vicar and Dr. Bertram began his preliminary inquiries, the whispers resumed. Mrs. Ridley, never one to let a silence pass, leaned toward Miss Marple and murmured, "A secret parcel? Delivered by hand? Oh, Jane, you do make life more intriguing than it ought to be." Miss Marple merely smiled. "It's not life that's intriguing, Elspeth, it's people. We so rarely do things for the reasons we claim." Outside, the sky had dimmed, and the bunting now fluttered in shadow. Somewhere across the village green, a piano played a few hesitant notes from an open cottage window. The party had dispersed, but the unease lingered, like a draught under a locked door. That evening, as lights dimmed across Oakley and the smell of geraniums thickened in the air, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor on Church Lane, knitting a moss-stitched scarf for the vicar's raffle and replaying the day's events in her mind. Not the body, not the blue lips or the shattered pince-nez, but the expressions of those fleeting, easily missed flinches. Gwen's glance. The good vicar's choice of words. The way Lady Clara had wrung her gloves when Biddle's name was mentioned. And that small parcel, yes, she thought, pressing her lips together as she purled a row. There was more to come. Much more. Sunday morning arrived in Oakley with all the decorum expected of the Sabbath. Bells from St. Petrock's rang softly through a light mist, drifting over rose hedges and overlaced chimneys. The village, still reeling from the shock of Lawrence Biddle's death, had not yet resumed its usual rhythm. Church attendance, however, was as punctual as ever, perhaps more so, now that the pews promised gossip as well as gospel. Miss Marple, seated third row from the front beneath the stained glass depiction of St. Luke, appeared no different than usual. Her hymnal was open, her hat modest, her singing a soft alto among the blend of warbling sopranos. But her mind wandered between verses. The previous evening's parish hall gathering had left many impressions, too many, in fact. No one seemed to know precisely what Mr. Biddle had been doing in the rose garden during tea. Nor could anyone account for the parcel Miss Marple had seen him tuck beneath his coat. Has it vanished? Been removed? Or had it never existed at all, merely a figment of her own observational enthusiasm? She doubted that very much. After the service concluded and the congregation began their usual ritual of lingering over the gravel path outside the church, Miss Marple made her way slowly down the steps. She was stopped, quite expectedly, by Lady Clara Spence, who looked rather more composed than she had the day before, though her gloves were still being kneaded anxiously between her palms. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice delicate with forced calm. "You were so steady during the whole dreadful business. I don't know how you manage." "Steady nerves often come from knitting and a lack of digestion," Miss Marple replied lightly. "But thank you. I must say, you were remarkably brave yourself." Lady Clara offered a tight smile, though her eyes flicked toward the growing cluster of villagers discussing Biddle's death in hushed tones. "I wonder if I might have a word." "Privately?" Miss Marple nodded, and they stepped aside toward the edge of the yew hedge. "I've been thinking," Lady Clara began, lowering her voice. "Mr. Biddle and I had corresponded this past week. He'd invited me to view some archival documents related to Oakley's early gentry, quite old, from the 17th century, I believe. He thought I might be interested in the next heritage exhibition." "How thoughtful of him," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes," but Lady Clara hesitated, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "The last note I received from him was odd. It wasn't like him. Rather vague. He said something about the truth buried in the grain of the oak and signed off rather abruptly." Miss Marple tilted her head. "A metaphor, perhaps? Or a warning? I can't be sure. But then the parcel, if it did exist, might have contained something related to those papers. Do you recall the date of the note?" 3 days ago. Thursday morning's post." Miss Marple nodded. "You've been very helpful, Lady Clara. And do let me know if any of the correspondence was preserved. Sometimes it's the phrasing, not the facts, that proves most enlightening." They parted with genteel smiles. But as Lady Clara swept away toward her waiting Bentley, her brow furrowed in concern. Miss Marple returned to her cottage on Church Lane not long after, bypassing an invitation from Mrs. Dawlish for another time. "My dear, I have dreadful things to them." Once home, she placed her bonnet on the hallway hook and carried a small tea tray to the sitting room. The kettle whistled gently in the background as she reviewed her mental checklist.